Does ray tracing make Halo Infinite look worse? Back during Season 3, Halo Infinite received a long overdue ray tracing update that first came to PC before making its way to Xbox Series X and S. The inclusion was pretty divisive, not because ray tracing is bad or anything, but more so that it was limited to just shadows cast by a map's sun, which is fairly underwhelming when stacked up against other games using ray tracing for things such as reflections, ambient lighting, global illumination, etc. Some people said that they couldn't tell a difference when looking at comparisons, and I've even heard some say they prefer how the game looked without ray tracing enabled. So again, does ray tracing make Halo Infinite look worse? I first loaded into a map that had a heavy focus on sunlight and somewhat busy buildings and trees. Oasis. Halo's graphical technology has lagged behind the competition for years now, but what keeps Halo Infinite looking great is just how much heavy lifting the artists did to make you not really notice the shortcomings. But I noticed them. Back in the early days of Halo's lighting model was a lot simpler, so you had a lot more thick shadows with clear edges that were benefited by the simpler level geometry. In order for the games to run smoothly, developers would bake the lighting into the level, making the shadows sort of a permanent part of a level's look. For dynamic objects, a more simple lighting system would allow these objects to cast their own shadows independent from the ones that were baked into the level's look. Couple that with developers literally drawing fake shadows in the gaps of levels or on character models themselves to fill in spots that the lighting engine was missing, and the final game and model turn out looking great. Halo 3 still looks great to this day due to all the various tricks Bungie pulled to give you the impression that the full game was lit and shaded realistically. Developers had far more control over how shadows looked and the conditions that they appeared in, but it did mean beyond those dynamic objects that did cast their own shadows, these baked shadows were pretty static and didn't respond to changes in lighting such as bright flashes, grenades going off, gunfire, etc., since again, it was all baked. Halo Infinite, on the other hand, uses a far more advanced and modern form of lighting that simulates real-world lighting and shading far more realistically, changing how shadows look depending on an object's texture, material, color, etc., and not really requiring developers to go over the game's shadows with a fine-toothed comb like Bungie had to back in Halo 3. Halo Infinite's lighting engine can produce some really pretty visuals, but it leaves a lot to be desired in the details. Shadows seem to be a thing it sort of struggles with. It gives the obvious stuff shadows, but the smaller stuff that grounds little objects in a game world are either missed entirely or sort of slapped with a smeary, half-hearted blob of gray, like the lighting engine was woken up from a nice dream, so it put in the least amount of effort it could, just out of spite. This somewhat low-resolution lighting model was probably selected so that the new consoles could run the game at 60 frames per second, and that the 2013 Xbox One could run the game in the first place. But the sacrifices, I think, cause Halo Infinite's lighting engine to miss enough spots that it can produce some pretty unflattering comparison images like this one that I found on Reddit that do paint Halo 3 as a better-looking game, even if, graphically, that isn't the case. Good news then, because enabling sun-casting ray tracing in Halo Infinite is genuinely transformative. All those grooves, gaps, dips, and coves now have the shadows they should have had to begin with. Railings, small pipes, weapon caches, handles, etc. All of that little stuff gets the love and attention it deserves. Which even if you don't instantly notice these shadows, once you do, you appreciate how much more natural it makes the game world look. It does look better, doesn't it? It's not just about adding more shadows to things, though. Ray tracing also helps add more realism to shadows by emulating the way a shadow gets fuzzier the further away its caster is from the ground or wall or whatever. Look at Zanzibar here. The shadow cast by the opening on the roof of this building I'm in is softer than the shadow cast by that ledge right there, because the ledge is a lot closer to the wall where the shadow is. In fact, ray tracing helps with Forge maps a lot. If that 4G look that Forge maps have ever bothers you with their flatter, more simplistic lighting, ray tracing helps smooth some of that out, giving depth to the corners these Forge maps desperately need, and making them look more comparable to developer-made maps. These benefits also extend to character shading. The characters of Halo Infinite are incredibly rendered and modeled. All they needed was better shading to truly bring out that detail. Look at that, isn't that nicer? It looks a lot more natural, with characters casting thick, realistic shadows on themselves. Remember that image I found on Reddit? Well, I recreated it, only this time I factored in ray tracing, and suddenly, Halo Infinite doesn't look too shabby. And look at this beautiful grunt, casting shadows on himself. Or this elite. I made a map from hell to test the ray tracing and its benefits in Forge. A map with a ton of fences, pipes on tops of bars and cages, etc. Some are even floating in the air and casting shadows over other items that are already casting shadows. And a cool detail I discovered here is even your first-person view model is affected by ray-traced shadows. With it off, walking through this cage will simply make your whole gun become duller than brighter, a way to sort of fake the non-ray-traced shadows crossing over the gun model. With ray tracing on, the shadows are properly cast on the gun, and it looks nice. Ray tracing also helps override the game's insanely, aggressively short draw distance for shadows. Those shadows are forced to stay and do their part. No leaving the game world looking blank and potatoey, Mr. Shadow. Even things beyond the playable map get shadows. See all those rocks that now have proper shadows and depth? Hell, what about the massive tower that is now casting its own shadow? All this fiddling about was fun and all, but it did make me notice something rather interesting. You see, I was going outside the level boundaries and trying to find random floating objects to see if even they got their own ray-traced shadows. Whenever I enabled ray tracing, trees would freeze in place. That's weird, right? Sure enough, it wasn't just trees. On the map Livefire, there's these tarp things that blow in the wind, and when ray tracing is enabled, they'd freeze up too. I made a windy version of Valhalla just to be sure, and sure enough, trees ignored the wind and froze up once ray tracing was enabled. So it seems as if this is an odd trade-off for the feature. Objects with animations will freeze in place. I'd imagine forgers would have a hard time with this if they're designing maps with lots of wind and trees swaying about. So let's repackage all this information. Does Halo Infinite's ray tracing make the game look better? Yes, absolutely, objectively, yes. On the downside, you lose a more lively atmosphere, since objects with animations seem to just freeze up. It may not be noticeable in the heat of a gunfight while you ride on the high of all these new shadows, but when standing still, the maps may feel subconsciously more dead and empty. In my opinion, on PC and Xbox Series X, make use of the ray tracing feature. The static foliage is a small price to pay for characters actually having shadows on themselves, and a better draw distance helps remind your brain that Halo Infinite is in fact a good-looking game, it just needed a better lighting engine. For Xbox Series S owners, however, I have some bad news. My experience with ray tracing on this little machine has been awful. It will sometimes look alright, but on more taxing maps, such as, well, literally any Forge map with foliage or complex geometry like the Exile remake, shadows begin to break apart in this weird way, the image gets pixely and grainy. This little box was just not meant for ray tracing, 60 frames per second, and a high resolution all at the same time. Maybe on the Series S, use ray tracing for 4v4 game modes, but anything larger than that, just no, keep it off. I do wonder though, is the visual quality of the Xbox Series S version, combined with the freezing of animated objects, was part of why campaign never got ray tracing support? It's a shame, because Halo Infinite's campaign mode could have benefited the most from ray tracing. Imagine this view, but with shadows cast far into the distance. Makes you wonder what could have been, huh? Hopefully this video is insightful, and stay shaded.